Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sanhedrin Daf Samach Aleph, Shavua Tov. Reminder for those who want to come to hear me in Manhattan, I will be there next Shabbat on February 28th, March 1st. So there's a dinner. If people want, you can register for the dinner. Otherwise, just come to shul, come hear the shiurim. You can come to the shiur at night even without going to the dinner. Everything's possibility. If you need information, you can email us and we will send it to you if you didn't see it by WhatsApp or email. Okay, we are going to, and yes, it's on Rosh Chodesh Hadar, which is nice. Okay, we're going to get started with our Gemara. So yesterday we learned about this Mishnah, Echad Hoved Avodah Zarah, right? So Hoved Avodah Zarah, someone who worships idols. Then Echad Hoved, Echad Mesabech, Echad Mekater, Echad Menasech, Echad Mishtachaveh, right? Those actions are specifically going to be, we differentiated between those actions, which are going to be liable, even if it's not the typical way of worshiping that idol, but you did any of those actions, versus all the rest of the actions, like kissing, hugging, cleaning, sweeping, any of those things, which only if that's the way you worship that idol are you going to be liable. And then we derive that all from the fact that there's two verses. There's two specific, it's almost like Shabbat, right? Where none of the malachot are really mentioned inside, but there's these two exceptions. And then we say, why do they mention them, right? Like there's hotzah, taking something out from one reshut to another. And then there's havara, lighting a fire. And this whole question, why are these exceptions? Why were these specified? Same thing here. Why was Zoveach specified and why was Tishachavayah specified? So they say, Zoveach represents a group of everything done in the temple. You do that to an idol, no matter what, you're going to be liable. Doesn't matter if that's the way it's typically worshipped, not the typical way. Hishtachavayah then, which isn't one of the actions generally done in the temple, that was differentiated to say, oh, just hishtachavayah, you're going to be, if that's besides zoveach, mekater, those few things that are done in the temple. When you get to things not generally done in the temple, there's only one that you're going to be liable no matter what. All the others, you're only going to be liable if that's the way of worshiping that. And that was because of these two verses. One, zoveach le'elohim yecharam, which was specifically about saying one gets killed if there's zoveach. From there, we learned the actions in the temple. And the Shtachava Pasuk, which basically was all about bowing. Now the Gemara comes up with a big question. And the Gemara, or Rava bar Rav Chanan, we're going to deal with this question for the first whole section of today's daf. In my Gemara, it's 3 lines from the bottom of Samach Hamud Bet. Amale Rava bar Rav Chanan la'abaye. Ema yatsa Shtachava lelamed al klal kula. Maybe we should ignore that Zevach Pasuk. And then maybe, and we'll explain in a minute why he wants to suggest ignoring it, maybe all we have is the Shechava Pasuk. Okay? And Zoveach is actually used for something else entirely. If Zoveach is used for something else entirely, Zoveach le'elohim yecharam, that Pasuk, then we're left with only one Pasuk. If we have one Pasuk only, it was only because we have these two Pasukim. Zoveach was representative of those. Shechava was representative really of everything else, but this stands alone from everything else, and therefore this is differentiated from everything else. If you have only one Pasuk, what do we usually say? It builds a paradigm for everything. And if you're going to be liable for bowing no matter what, you bow down to any idol, even if that's not the way the idol is worshipped, you're going to be obligated. Maybe every single action you do with an idol, you're going to be obligated for. You kiss the idol, even if that's not the way they generally worship it, maybe you're obligated for that. You get the death penalty. That's his suggestion. But now we have to understand a little bit better. What does he do with the word, with the pasuk Zoveach le'elohim yecharam? If he doesn't use it to teach our issue, then what's it coming to teach? The chi tema, and if you want to say Zoveach lamali, well, then what's the Zoveach pasuk coming to do, if not for what we said earlier? Legufe, you could say it's coming for its own sake. What's that for? De mechashevin me'avodah lavodah. Okay, his questions could get a little bit more complicated than this because we're going to quote a machloken. He's going to say my question is only according to one opinion, and we're going to read this machloken in a bunch of different ways. It's a little bit confusing, but let me get the basics here. There's something you have to really start with pigul. There's something called pigul in the temple, which is, okay, if you learn Zvachim, you know this. If you haven't gotten to Zvachim yet, which we'll get to soon, it's one of the first things we learn. It's one of the big differentiators, and I'll explain it to you outside because I think you'll get it when you understand this. The big differentiators between, anyone who's learned with me for a long time knows I like to talk about this, between Nizikin and the world of Korbanot. When we get there, when we're going to do that transition from Nizikin to Korbanot, we're going to talk about this because Nizikin, it doesn't matter. Whether you wanted to do it, whether you didn't want to do it, in the end you damage someone, you have to pay for damages. We don't care what you intended. When it comes to the temple, your intent is super important. It's the most important thing is what you're intending. You're intending worship to God, If you have thoughts while you're bringing a sacrifice, let's say you're slaughtering the animal, and you think, I'm going to sprinkle the blood tomorrow, or I'm going to sprinkle the blood outside the temple, you've ruined your korban because the blood has to be sprinkled on that same day, and it has to be done in the temple, obviously. And if you have some sort of thought that you're doing it wrong, you're going to do the blood, or you're going to burn the parts on the altar tomorrow, or you're going to burn them outside the temple, or something like that. There's chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo, which are two categories of pigul. There's actually a difference, the halacha between them. Not going to get into all those details, but the fact is, you destroy the korban. Depending on which one you get karet, okay, it's very serious. Now, yes, this could be the Kohen, it could be the owner. It's often the Kohen who does this. The Kohen usually is the one who messes it up. Shchita actually could be done by Yisrael, but other avodah only by the Kohen. And anyway, it could be the Kohen. We're going to get into the Kohen, and then it's to compensate because you ruined your korban. Talk about all that. Exactly. Those are all the interesting questions that come up there, but that's not our topic for today. But what do you see there? In the temple worship, your thoughts while you're slaughtering could mess up this animal, right? It's considered important, your thoughts, enough that it can mess up a sacrifice. So now we want to know, what if I slaughter an animal for my own sake? I want to eat the animal. But while I'm slaughtering it, I think, I'm going to take this blood and I'm going to bring it to an idol and sacrifice it on an altar to this idol. Or I'm going to burn the fats that are normally burnt in the temple. I'm going to burn these fats on the altar. So I slaughtered it for my own sake, but I had a thought. I didn't even do anything yet, but my thought at the time was, I'm going to put the blood on the altar. So that's what we're talking about. Machashvim avodah lavodah. While you're in one avodah, you're thinking about doing a different avodah to the idol. De'itmar. And here we're going to see a machloket, and then he's going to ask his question more specifically according to one of these opinions. If I slaughter an animal with the intent to sprinkle the blood for an idol, again, I'm slaughtering the animal for my own sake, not for idols. But I'm thinking, you know what? I'll take the blood from here and I'll give it to this idol, or, okay, it says and, but it means or, to burn the fats on the altar for idol worship. Rabbi Yochanan Amar. Now here, let me just be very clear before we get to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. We're talking about, if you did this, is the pasuk Sofech Elohim Yechram. We're suggesting maybe it doesn't come for our other issue. Maybe it's coming to teach you, one who does this, remember what Yechram means, will be killed. Okay? Machloket Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about the animal. What's the status of that animal? So they have a machloket, and Rabbi Yochanan says the status of that animal is, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, asura. The animal is forbidden. Why is the animal forbidden? Not because of Zohech Elohim Yacharam. The animal is forbidden because it's like pigul. We're going to basically learn from pigul to avodah zarah. And if pigul in the temple is a thing, then machshava, avodah lavodah, which is basically pigul, but we're not going to call it pigul because it's for idols, is a thing too. And such a thing that this animal now, which I slaughtered for my own sake to eat, I can't eat. It's forbidden to benefit from. Now, Reish Lakish Amar Muteret. Reish Lakish says, no, just by my thoughts, I didn't mess up the animal. Okay, now remember, there's two different issues here, and we're going to talk about this a lot now, which is, one is the animal forbidden? And one is the person get the death penalty for doing it? Those are two very different things, but they connect them right now. And comes Rava bar Rav Chanan and says the following. Hanicha Rabbi Yochanan. According to Rabbi Yochanan, I have no question. Because Rabbi Yochanan learns the whole thing from pigul, and that's why he says the animal's forbidden. And if the animal's forbidden, just like in our world, the sacrifice would be ruined, well, we assume that goes hand in hand with, and the person gets killed. So I don't need a pasuk Zobeach Elohim Yecharam to teach you that. So my question isn't according to that, because according to that, okay, again, we have to remember where we started. Then the pasuk, there's one about Hishtachavaya, there's one about Zobeach, and they each teach their own thing, and that's how we got to our Mishnah and the differentiation in our Mishnah. And that's fine, because Rabbi Yochanan doesn't need that pasuk. But according to Reish Lakish, Reish Lakish by crap. According to Reish Lakish, now, here's the tricky part. Reish Lakish thinks, if I think, while I'm slaughtering my animal for my own sake, that I'm going to sprinkle the blood for idols, the animal's permitted. But Rava bar Chanan assumes that he thinks the person gets killed for doing this, though, okay? Even though the animal is still permitted to benefit from. You haven't done anything to the animal, but of course you've done something. You wanted to worship idols, and you actually did an action that's going to lead you to do idol worship. That, and you have the thought, I'm going to do idol worship, you're going to be killed. So for him, perhaps the pasuk and that the question is only according to Reish Lakish, at least right now, then the question is according to Reish Lakish. Why, if that's the case, isn't Zoveach Le'Elohim Yachram going to teach us that halacha? Which means it's not free to do what we said it is, which means we only have one pasuk. If we only have one pasuk about bowing, maybe bowing sets the tone for all the Isurim, and anything you do to idols will be obligated, whether it's the way you worship it or you don't worship it. Kiss, hug, right? Everything. That's his question. So the first thing we're going to do, it's actually the first two things we're going to do with him. We're going to do a bunch of things with him. Are introduced by matkif. So that means like an attack on him. Okay, but one, it's don't get confused by them. They're not doing the same thing, and this is what makes the sugya a little bit confusing. The first one is attacking the fact that his question is only according to Reish Lakish, and they're going to say, you can ask your question according to Rabbi Yochanan as well. The second attack is going to be, I have an answer for you. So it's really going to be an answer. Okay, I have an answer to your question. Then we're going to have some other things to deal with him still. But right now, those are the first two, so I'm organizing that outside. Matkif la Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, I don't even understand. Why is your question only according to Reish Lakish? Rabbi Yochanan lo ba'ikra. Rabbi Yochanan would also need the pasuk. Just because you learn from pigul that the animal is forbidden doesn't necessarily mean that you learn the person gets the death penalty. So, ad kan lo ka'asa Rabbi Yochanan lo beheman is machloka with Reish Lakish. All he did was forbid the animal. Aval gavra lo bar katalahu. And that's he didn't say that person's supposed to get killed. He didn't learn that from pigul, and therefore, according to him, now doesn't mean he doesn't think the person should get killed. Now we say, so Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are really in the same boat because neither of them thought that pasuk teaches you the person gets killed, right? One didn't even think the animal's forbidden, but even the one who thinks the animal was just talking about the animal. What we're going to basically do is isolate the animal issue and say it's not connected. We're going to do that in the answer also, but from a different perspective, okay? So now, and then, according to Rabbi Yochanan, you could ask the same question and say, doesn't Rabbi Yochanan need the pasuk to teach you that if you do this, you're going to get killed? Which then leads us back to the question. Now the question is according to both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So that was the first sort of attack on Rav Chanan, which is, I don't even understand why you limited your question to Reish Lakish. It should be also according to Rabbi Yochanan. Now, matkifla, the second hatkafa, is really saying, I have an answer for you. I don't know why they introduce it with a matkif, but almost saying, I don't even understand your question. It's so obvious what the answer is. Matkifla Rav Acha b'rei Rav Ika. Ula Reish Lakish mi ba'ikra. Forget about, I don't think Rabbi Yochanan needs the pasuk Zoveach Le'Elohim Yachram like you asked originally. Forget about the last Rav Papa who just said that. But even according to Reish Lakish, you don't need that pasuk to teach it to you. Because again, if you isolate the issue, Ad kan lo kashari Reish Lakish ala behemah. When Reish Lakish said the animal is permitted, he was only talking about the animal. But it's obvious from pigul, aval gavra bar katalahu midi dahavi. Now he's going to say, obviously the person who did this, who thought I'm going to slaughter this animal for myself, but take the blood and put it on the altar for this idol, of course he's going to be bar katalahu. Of course he's going to get killed. It's like pigul. Of course, your machshava, your intent is important. If your intent is important, yes, you've destroyed this, So maybe the animal you could still eat. We're not going to forbid the animal, but you're liable to the death penalty, okay? It doesn't transfer to the animal, perhaps. But of course, you did something terrible. So now they're going to say, how do we know this? Okay, here you're asking, Becky, why is the animal allowed? That's the next line of the Gemara. He's going to say, I'm going to show you an example. Where is an example where the person is obligated, but the item is not forbidden to benefit from? If somebody bowed down to a mountain, remember we learned al haharim, remember destroy their idols that are on the mountains. Now, what did we learn? Idols on the mountains, not that the mountains are idols themselves, which means that mountains don't get forbidden, okay? Which means, let's say you want to take a nice hike there, you can go hike there and don't say, oh, I can't go there because that's a mountain they worshipped. So, har mutal ve'ovda b'sayif. Now here they say something we didn't learn last time. It doesn't mean you can worship a mountain. If you worship a mountain, of course you're going to get killed. I don't know why b'sayif, why you get beheaded, okay, decapitated. I'm not sure why, and not stoned. But the point is that here we have an example where something might not become forbidden to benefit from, but the person actually could get killed. And therefore, he says, there's the answer to your question. Okay? Zovech leluhim yecheram is not needed to teach who the person gets killed. Everyone agrees, even according to Reish Lakish. They both agree the person gets killed. Their whole machloket is only about the animal. So we kind of did it in both directions, where we said their whole machloket is only about the animal. And of course, they would both need a pasuk to say the person gets killed to gain the opposite, which is it's only about the animal. And they both don't need a pasuk to say the animal gets killed. And therefore, the pasuk is free for our original drasha. But we're not finished yet because we now have two questions on where did you even come up with this idea? Okay, and we're going to say, why did you even ask this question, Rav Chanan? Where your question doesn't make any sense even. Okay, so now we're going to say, Amar le Rav Acha midifti le Ravina. Okay, without getting into the details of Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan, we're done with that. But they're going to bring other psukim which seem to indicate that there's no reason for this question at all. Like, how did you even ask this? So Rav Acha midifti says to Ravina, it's a different Rav Acha than we just had before. That was Rav Acha b'rid Rav Ika. This is Rav Acha midifti. L'maydeka amar le Rava bar Rav Natan la'abaye ema yatza shachavaya l'meda l'klal kulo. Right, according to what he said, that suggesting again, it's only his suggestion. It's not that he says this is the case. He was just suggesting it, but they're saying, what kind of suggestion? You said maybe Ishtachavaya came to, not you, because he's talking to someone else about what Rav Chanan said. He said that that perhaps Shtachavaya teaches about the whole group, that what? Any action you do, right, is basically going to be forbidden no matter what, whether it's the way it's worshipped, whether it's not the way it's worshipped. Well, then there's another pasuk that doesn't make any sense, because the pasuk here is in Dvarim chapter 12, verse 30. It starts off, I'm going to read from the beginning. Beware when you go into the land that you don't follow their ways and then stumble upon their bad ways. If you destroy them, and don't start looking into their gods, saying, don't start researching and saying, how do they worship their gods? Because I want to worship in the way they worship. Notice what this seems to be saying, right? Rav Chanan's question was, you be liable even if you don't worship it in the way. So if that's the case, why is it saying don't start learning how they did it? Because what's the difference? Any way you worship their idols is going to be a problem. So what's this pasuk lemiutemai? What's it coming to tell you? It must that if we take Rav Chanan's question seriously, what he thought anyway, right? It's not true, but his suggestion that perhaps you're liable in any way you do it, then what would this be coming to exclude? This must be coming to exclude there's some way you would worship it not in its typical way that you wouldn't be obligated. Otherwise, why on earth would you be researching this? Now, perhaps you would say, we have a good example. L'zovchim means you have a god, an elil, a pesel, a avodah zarah, that people normally sacrifice animals to. And you decided to do lif'ol. Remember what that is? It's to pull down your clothes and defecate on the pesach. So maybe you'd say that's what it's coming to say, right? If you do that, you're not going to be obligated. And that's why you'd have to learn, how do you do it so you don't, because if you do pa'or to someone that's not Baal pa'or, you're not going to be liable. Well, that for sure, anyway, we would have learned from Ishtachavaya. Even if Ishtachavaya includes any way you worship this animal, this idol, it's not going to include that anyway, because it has to be similar to bowing. What is bowing? Derech kibud. That's a respectful way of worshiping. We're obviously only including in there respectful ways of worshiping. Af kol derech kibud. So we wouldn't need a special pasuk to say if you do peor to an idol that's not the way you worship it, that normally people worship it by positive means. I wouldn't need a pasuk for you to tell me that. That's already learned from Ishtachavaya, because Ishtachavaya would only include, yes, it includes Shalom Kedarka, not the typical way, but only not the typical way when it's respectful. Okay, but they come up with an answer for him, which is you could still think, like Rava bar Rav Chanan, again, we don't do this, but you could still suggest that Ishtachavaya pasuk is coming to teach about everything, and derech kavod, but you'd still need this pasuk, echayabdu, to exclude one case. What would it be? A very unique case. Remember, Baal Peor is the one they do Peor, right? They defecate in front of it. Markulis, they throw stones. Now, throwing stones is also disrespectful. So what if you do a disrespectful act to a god, an Elil, an Avodah Zarah, that generally you do disrespectful things, but you swap which disrespectful thing you do to it. Since it anyway you worship it in a disrespectful manner, maybe you'd be liable for that. That's what the pasuk Echayavdu comes to teach you. You research how to do it. Okay, well, you're not going to be liable for any derech bisayon, even if normally it's a disgraceful way of worshiping. If you swap which disgraceful way, you're not going to be liable. Kamash malan, and that's what you would need that pasuk for, and therefore we don't really have a question. Okay, last question on Rava bar Rav Chanan, and then we're going to move on to the next sugya. Elahad amar Rabbi Elazar, it should be Elazar, it says Rabbi Elazar, maybe in your text it should be Rabbi Elazar. Minayim v'zovech behema l'merkulis shu chayav. So how do you know if you sacrifice an animal to markulis? Because remember, people only threw stones. How do you know if you sacrifice an animal that it's chayav? Now, there's this pasuk. Okay, we have ime chayav do already, which teaches you only the way the animals are worshipped, the idols are worshipped. Okay, then we have this other pasuk. You can't do your zivchehem to seirim. Okay, the seirim was also an idol, a way of worshiping idols. Now, if already Echayavdu told you, well, you have to know how they worship them because you're only going to be obligated in the way that you're supposed to worship them. Then what is this extra pasuk of lo yizbechu od zivchehem l'seirim coming to teach you? So imenoinyan l'kedarka, because dichtiv Echayavdu, it already says that pasuk. Then tneuinyan l'shalo kedarka. Now you have these two pasukim. They play off each other. They're kind of saying one and the same thing. So they say the following. The first one, Echayavdu, must be coming to say, right, learn how they do it because you're only obligated in the way that they do it. The second one must be coming to say you're even obligated not in the normal manner, okay? Which means, that's a classic imeno inyan, since it can't be coming to teach the obvious, must be teaching something less obvious. Then, shelo kedarka me'ishtachava nafka. Well then, why would you, now he's asking a totally different type of question. Why would Rabbi bar Rav Chanan suggest that we're going to learn from Ishtachava'a Shalo Kedarka? He could have said it from Lo Yizbechu Od Tzivcheihem. So why did he use that pasuk and not that one really? So then they say, no, because Hatam is Ovech Lahachis. You could explain the pasuk Lo Yizbechu Od Tzivcheihem the Seirim as coming to teach you, don't offer animals to the Seirim if you're doing it because you're angry at God. In other words, even if you're not doing it to worship the idols because you believe that these are gods, but you're just angry at God, and as an angry act, you say, I'm going to go sacrifice to the Seirim, that's forbidden also, even though it's not a Avodah Zarah. Okay, they're basically saying, you're not believing that this is a God, you're not doing it for that reason, you're still going to be obligated. And then, it's not an Imeno Inyan, and that answers the question against Rabbi Bar Chanan, that again, then there is at least room for him to ask his question. Maybe Shtachava'a is the one that's teaching you Shalo Kedarka, which they suggested maybe, what do we do with what Rabbi Elazar said? Well, we can understand Rabbi Elazar is talking about Zoveach Lahachis and not our case. Okay, so again, we had a bunch of questions of Rabbi Rav Chanan's question and different sorts of questions. Why did he only ask this question on Reish Lakish? Actually, we have an answer to both Reish Lakish, and not Rabbi Yochanan. Actually, we have an answer, right? The whole machloket is kind of different. And then we had some other psukim in the Torah that we brought that we thought really were relating to similar issues, and we basically explained, no, they're not. Okay, now we start our next sugya with a story, which we're going to leave the story immediately. And you wonder why they brought this. Maybe it's just as a good way of remembering because it's kind of funny. Not really funny, but it's just the way they introduce it, I think is kind of funny. Rav Hamnuna irkasule Torah. So Rav Hamnuna lost his oxen and went to search for them. While he was searching for his oxen, pagabe Rabba bumps into him, and Ramale matnitin adade. And Rabba says, I'm so glad I saw you. I know you're busy trying to find your oxen, but I've got a halakhic question for you, or really a parshanut question, or a something question. We'll see right now. I have a contradiction between our Mishnah and the Mishnah on Daf Samach Zayin. Okay, which was not Daf Samach Zayin at that point, but meaning I have a problem with the Mishnah that's coming up. Tanan, ha'oved avodah zarah, and this is going to be the bulk of our sugya for today. Ha'oved avodah zarah. Now, our Mishnah was very clear. If you worship, right, so I agree with you, Terry. I think it's all to help you remember this, because once you have that story, that intro, you remember what the story is. So now you're worshiping avodah zarah in our Mishnah. you're liable for worshiping, right? For slaughtering, for all those actions. Now notice they're all actions. It never says anywhere if you say you're going to worship idols, you're going to be obligated, right? So it says in the Mishnah, oved in omer lo. If you say I want to worship an idol, you're not obligated, which makes sense because we've talked a lot in sugyot, but well, sort of makes sense or it doesn't make sense. It's actually related to the previous sugya. You just have in your mind to do something, you could even possibly be obligated. So maybe if you say you will be obligated. So where do we put saying? Where do we put our speech, right? On the one hand, we have lots of sugyas which put a lot of importance into speech. We have Masechtot, all about speech, Nidarim, right? Shvuot, Nazir, all about saying, making this declaration. On the other hand, we have Lav Shem Bomasa, you don't get lashes for. If it's just words, you don't get lashes for that kind of thing. It's just words, not an action. So words are always a bit in between there. It depends on the sugya. So it seems from here that you actually are not obligated by just saying, I'm going to worship idols. However, Vahan Ansnan, don't we say in the Mishnah further on, which I said is we'll learn this next Shabbat, Ha'omer e'avod, elech v'avod, nelech v'navod, you're going to be obligated. You say, I'm going to worship. We're going to worship. Let's go worship. Okay? Well, I'll go worship. You're obligated. I'm going to raise a question here, which I'm not going to answer. But when we get to that next Mishnah, you're going to see that they took this entirely out of context. Because the Mishnah there is not talking about someone who worships idols, which this Mishnah is clearly viewing it that way. It's talking about somebody who sways someone else to worship idols, the Macy, who says, let's go worship idols. So it's talking, the quote there is in that person's words. I'm going to worship, and basically meaning, and come with me. Or let's go worship, okay? But right now, they're viewing the Mishnah, and I don't have a good answer. I mean, the commentaries all provide answers. You can look at, you can look at commentaries, you can look at footnotes if you have a Gemara with commentaries on it. There's all different answers provided. I'm not going to get into that today. Right now, we're going to just view it that they took this a little bit out of context, but they assume that Mishnah means even the person who worships idols, by saying the word alone, I'm going to worship, is already going to get punished. So we're now going to have 7 answers to this contradiction. Some can be categorized a little similar to each other. Some are different kind of answers. First one kind of stands on its own. So the Rav Hamnuna answered him the following way. Amar le, be'omer eini mekablo alai ela ba'avodah. He says, oh, really you're obligated for speaking alone. By saying, oh, I'm going to worship idol. So our Mishnah that seemed to indicate only if you actually worship is a unique case. It's a case where you said, and that's not a unique case. It could be any case where you worshiped idols. But if you said it, you won't be obligated if you said the following statement. If you said, I want to worship idols, but I'm only going to worship it when I worship. In other words, I'm only going to accept it as a God upon me, for me, when I go do some action, then you'll only be obligated at the action. Okay, it's definitely not the simple reading of our Mishnah because who said that that's what the person said, but that's Rav Hamnun's answer. You could almost think about it if you go back to, he was looking for his oxen. He was a little distracted and kind of just threw out an answer. And, later people had more thought out, well-presented answers, possibly, you could say, right? Sometimes when someone asks you on the fly, you come up with an answer that later you think about, Anyway, it does sound like it's sort of an answer on the fly, but again, we do this all the time. Called an ukimta. We say, even though it didn't say so, this Mishnah was talking about a particular unique case. Rabbi Yosef Amar. So we're going to have 2 answers of Rabbi Yosef because after Rabbi Yosef brings his answer, he's actually going to knock it out and say, oh, you know what, it's not true. Rabbi Yosef Amar, Tanai shakalta me'alma? Tanai, he says, you're putting to these Mishnayot as if they were said by the same person. Are you wiping out Tanaim? It's a machloket Tanaim. One reflects one opinion, one reflects the other opinion. And by you saying this contradicts, you're basically erasing one of the Tanaim and saying, oh, this is all one and the same. But of course, they say different things because one is one opinion and one is the other. One is Rabbi Meir, one is Rabbi Yehuda. How do we see this? Tanya says in Braita, Ha'omel bo'u v'ivduni. I come to you and I say, let's go worship me. I'm an idol, okay? I'm someone worthy of worshiping. So if I say that to you, Rabbi Meir mechayev, Rabbi Meir obligates, okay? And let's say you agree. Rabbi Meir says you're obligated. Rabbi Yehuda potel. Rabbi Yehuda says no. If you agree, you're exempt. Okay. So if you agree, Rabbi Meir says you're obligated. Words alone. Rabbi Yehuda says you're not obligated. Okay? Right. Words alone, I should just be clear. Rabbi Meir says you're obligated. Words alone can obligate you. Rabbi Yehuda says you're exempt because words alone don't do anything. Now, let's just understand this a little bit better. If they actually, okay, so I say, and the question is, what are they really talking about? I kind of explained the conclusion already, but they have to kind of reject a bunch of opinions. If I say, go worship me, and you do, then obviously you're going to be obligated. Everyone's going to agree with that. Our parsha from yesterday. 10 Commandments, what does it say? Don't make yourself a pesel. What does it mean, don't make yourself a pesel? Don't make yourself into a pesel. Okay, the usual simple reading would be don't make a pesel for yourself, but don't make yourself into a pesel. Don't make yourself into an idol. Okay, and therefore, if you did make yourself into an idol and people worship you, of course, you're all obligated. Ki pligi b'dibura ba'alma. The machloket is words alone, and that's how we get to our machloket. Rabbi Meir savar dibura milti, Rabbi Yehuda savar dibura lav milti. So you're agreeing either is considered or isn't considered, and that's exactly the machloket between these two mishnayot. Why are you raising a contradiction? There, it's a machloket. But Hadran Rav Yosef said, wait a minute. This is a unique case, this thing about worship me. It's not the same as worship idols, okay? It's different. We'll see why in a minute. Lav milti da'amrei, what I said isn't true. Da'afilu l'Rabbi Yehuda b'dibura nami chiyuvei mechayev. Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, even b'dibura of all worship idols is already forbidden. But that's not this case. Ditanya, it should be Ditanya, not Ditnan. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Lo no chayav ad shemar avod, elech v'avod nelech v'navod. Okay, so first of all, Rabbi Yehuda agrees with Rabbi Meir in a regular case. And then we're back to square one with our question. Because Rabbi Yehuda says you're chayav in dibur alone, and then you can't say Rabbi Yehuda, who is exempted in the other case, will exempt here as well. And that's our Mishnah, because Rabbi Yehuda clearly disagrees with our Mishnah. If our Mishnah says only if the actions, not words, Rabbi Yehuda says, oh, even words, you'll be obligated. So now we just have to explain, okay, we're going to have to go back and explain a different resolution to the contradiction because that one didn't work to say it's a machloket and aim. But now we're going to explain at least before we get there what the machloket between him and Rabbi Meir is. So this goes back to, did I mean what I said or was I being sarcastic? So now we're going to say the following. Okay, again, that's the case we said. Their only machloket is if I try to get you to worship me as an idol. And you said yes. And now we have a machloket. What did you mean when you said yes? Okay, so Rabbi Meir, who says chayav, says when I encourage you to worship me as an idol, I could convince you. You could be convinced to go worship a person. So when you said yes, you said yes seriously. Umar Saval, Rabbi Yehuda says, nobody would agree to worship another person as an idol. Why is that? And it's a fascinating machloket. You can think about this. Do people worship other humans or not? Right? Meimar Amre, people will say, what's the difference between you and me? This is almost like when we get to Yarei Val Yavor, who say my blood is redder than yours. That I shouldn't get killed in, just 1 second. And therefore, indika amre achuche ale. When you said, "Oh yes, sure, I'll worship you," you weren't serious. Nobody would be serious about that kind of thing. And there's our machloket. Okay, would people be serious or not? So when they said yes, did they really mean it or not? And this has nothing to do with our topic. Okay, fascinating topic in and of itself. Third answer now. Apparently, this is Rabbi Yosef giving his second answer since he rejected the first. So now we're at the top of Amud Bet. Umatnitin, kam biyachid aniset, kam b'rabim anisetin. Now we're going to start a slew of answers that all are a similar type thing, which is what's more likely that people will, when they say they're going to do something, do they really mean it or not? It's kind of similar to what we just said, but that wasn't a resolution to the contradiction. And it a little bit connects with the topic we're going to get to soon, which is nidon al shem safo. Sometimes we can judge you for what we assume you're going to do. So if you say you're going to do it, if we assume you're going to do it, we can already obligate you. If we don't assume you might change your mind, then we're not going to obligate you for just saying it. So now we're going to have, I think it's at least 2 answers that are like this. I think it's just 2 that are going to be of this genre. So, Matnitin kan b'yachid anisei, kan b'rabim anisatim. There's a difference between an individual who gets convinced and a lot of people who get convinced. Yachid, if I convince you to go worship idols and you say, yes, I'm coming with you, right? Again, this is not anymore me. I just say, come, let's worship idols. And you say, yes, sure. Yachid lo mimlach b'tai batrei. You're not going to change your mind. You agreed to go with me, you'll go with me. And therefore, we can obligate you just by saying it alone. And that's the next Mishnah. Not the next one, but the Mishnah we just further on. Rabim mimlache velo tau batrei. But if you have a lot of people, that I convinced a lot of people to go worship idols, at that point, you're not going to necessarily end up going with me because one of those people might start raising a doubt, and then other people will start raising a doubt, and then it might not ever happen. Okay, again, you can maybe argue with this theory, but it's a theory. So Amar of Yosef Menamina, and he says, I'm going to prove to you where I get this from. Dichtiv lo tovelo velo tishmaila. Now it says by the Mesit, when the Mesit comes and someone tries to convince you, don't go with him and don't listen to him, okay? So now we say the following, ha'ava v'shama chayav. Why does it say don't go with him, don't listen to him? Because just by listening alone or saying you're going to go with them, you're already obligated. So that's why the Torah tells you don't do that because we're already going to obligate you if you do. And that's an individual. Abaye says, what are you talking about? Mishane ben niseti rabim l'niseti yachid. V'hatanya. It says in a Braita. And says, why are you differentiating between someone who gets an individual to worship idols and someone who gets a lot of people to worship idols? The Torah all says the same thing. The lo toveh v'lo tishma is said to everybody, whether the Mesi gets 10 people or one person. Kisitcha achicha benimecha. Right, sorry, a Braita says, quotes that pasuk, Kisitcha achicha benimecha, if your brother, the son of your mother, sways you to worship idols. Echad yachid anisei rabim anisatim. Okay, so it's whether an individual, whether it's rabim. But now you would think this is a little tricky because what it's saying is that pasuk theoretically should be talking about rabim, but hotzia katuv yachid michlal rabim v'rabim michlal yachid. However, the Torah is separated because if you remember, there's a mesi to get an individual to worship idols, and then there's a mediach who's someone who gets a whole city to worship idols. So that's a difference, yachid rabim. The Torah did differentiate, comes Abai, but Abai is going to point out, the Torah differentiated and gave different rules, but they gave a list of what the different rules are. And they didn't say this, so it must be this isn't a difference between them. Okay, and that's how he rejects Rav Yosef. He says, you would have thought it includes everybody, right? Whether it's an individual that the person swayed, or whether it's a lot of people. But however, the Torah had one pasuk that talked about the individual, different set of pasukim that talked about one set of pasukim that talked about the individual, a different set talked about a person who swayed a lot of people. Yachid michlal rabim. So now we're going to go into each one. Why did it say the individual versus a lot of people? Lahachmir al gufo lahakel al mamono. To say we're going to be more strict about your punishment, you get stoned, and we're going to be more light on your money. We're not going to destroy all your property. And Rabim Michlal Yachid, it's going to be the reverse. And when it said about a lot of people, the city, it was to tell you la kela gufam, they only get killed by saif, by decapitation. Ulachmir mamonam, but all their property gets burned. And notice, Baha Milta hu deshane, specifically in that way they're different. But in every other way they're the same. And therefore you can't start saying, if one said they're obligated, the Rabim said they're not obligated. The Torah didn't say that. The Torah specifically separated them and told you all the differences and didn't say this. So Abai rejects Rav Yosef. So on to answer number 4. Elam Rabbi, kam b'niseit mipi atzmo, kam b'niseit mipi achirim. Now we have a difference between a person who worships idols on their own and a person who gets swayed by somebody else. Which way is it going to go? You could start thinking, well, mipi atzmo mimlach, mipi achirim garu batrayu. If you decide yourself to worship idols, you might change your mind, right? How many times we think to do something and then we change our mind about it. But if somebody pulls you into doing it, there's peer pressure there. The peer pressure is very strong. You're probably going to end up sticking with it. Okay, maybe you won't decide to do it in the first place. Maybe peer pressure is not that strong. But once you say yes, it's very unlikely you're going to turn around and back out of it. Rabbi Menami, where do I get this from? He says, the same pasuk that Rav Yosef tried to prove. So here you see, where does that appear? In the Mesi pasuk. In the Mesi pasuk, just saying it alone is enough, or deciding to do it is enough. but that only appears in the Mesi pasuk. It doesn't appear in the psukim about people worshiping idols, and that's how he distinguishes this Mishnah and the other Mishnah. Fifth answer, Rava Amar Edi v'Edi. Okay, this is already a little different because each time we rejected the previous one. Now we're not having rejections; we're just having different answers. Rava Amar Edi v'Edi b'nisei mipi achirim. Both could be where someone swayed you. So he doesn't agree with Abaye. Gives a different answer. Hada Amarle kach ochelek kach shota kach mitiva kach mireah. Hada lo Amarlo kach ochelek kach shota, etc. If they gave you a convincing, oh, this is their power, this is how strong they are, this is what they do, then you might be convinced. And if you say yes, you're going to go with it. If they just said, come worship, and you said yes, but they didn't tell you what's so great about this God, this pesel, this whatever, this idol, then maybe you won't. So, and then you won't be obligated for just saying. That would be our Mishnah. So I'm a Rava, Allah, what's my proof? Dichtiv, melohei ha'amim asher svivotechem akrovim elecha. Now you have to keep reading. O harichokim. It says, if they, from the other nations that are near you, that are close to you or that are far from you. Now, mali krovim umali rechokim. Why does the pasuk say that are close or that are far? Well, they want to say hachi ka'amrle. Mitivutan shel krovim atalamim mativutan shel rechokim. What they're trying to say is like this. How would someone convince you to worship an idol that's far? By telling you all these things about it, right? If an idol's right there, they'll just say, come worship this idol. And you can see the idol for yourself. If they're telling you to go worship an idol that's far away, you don't see the idol. The only way they could do it is by convincing you, by saying this idol's great. Now, what the pasuk is telling you is you should learn from the ones you see nearby, which you see are not worth anything. And it's, don't try to let someone convince you. It's like saying the grass is greener on the other side. You'll see this idol in front of you and you'll say like, okay, I'm not going to worship that. It's just a piece of clay. But they can convince you there's some idol far away that you should really go do. And the pasuk is telling you, look at the ones near you. And from that, you should learn not to do the ones that are far away. So now they say, my lav da amrle, right? So what does it mean, this whole issue of rechokim? How could they even try to convince you? It must be that they said, what that basically proves, it's a little different to proof, it's just proving there is such a thing, that someone could try to convince you to do something that's far away by saying all these praises of it. And then that would be a case where we assume that if you say, agree, you're going to worship it, you probably will, because they've convinced you very strongly about this. Okay. Rav Acha, Seifa b'Yisrael mumar. Rav Acha gives a different explanation. Says, oh, the next Mishnah, the farther on Mishnah that says even if you say you're going to do it, that's someone who already. By the way, some people might have mishumad. Okay, there are two different words for basically saying someone who left the religion. If they decide they don't believe in God anymore, and then they say they're going to worship idols, so okay, it makes sense they're going to go ahead with it. If they're still view themselves as practicing Judaism, then they might change their minds, and we're not going to obligate them until they actually worship it. Ravina Amar lo zo afzo katane. Ravina gives a totally different answer, which basically rejects the question entirely and says no contradiction. It's saying if you worship idols, and then it's telling you, and even if you say you're going to do them, okay, and you're going to be obligated either which way. So that was 7 answers. Again, some of them, right? We had all different types. One was ukimta, right? It's just if you say I'm only going to worship it once I start, right? I'm only going to do it once I really actually worship it. Then we had the second answer was, let me just review. The second answer was, right, it's a machloket tanaim, so there's no even contradiction, which is similar to the last answer, which is there's no contradiction because it's actually both. Those both have the option that it's not even a contradiction. Then we had the 2 middle ones, which were kind of saying it's that we assumed you're going to actually go ahead with it, and that depends on, right, Yechiv Rabim, or whether it's you decided on your own, or someone is pulling you to do it. And then we had the 5th and the 6th answer, which was, either they convinced you, they gave you a convincing answer. Maybe those 3 are of the same genre, which is you're unlikely to change your mind. And Rav Acha says, which also theoretically you could say you're unlikely to change your mind because you already left the religion. So maybe all those 4 are kind of similar. Okay, Itmar. Now we get to our last machloket, which is ha'oved avodah zarah me'ahava u'miyirah. Let's say you have a friend who you really love and they want you to worship idols with them. So you do it because you love them, not because you believe that this is a God. You just do it to go along with them. I'll come to your whatever ceremony. Or you're scared of someone. They fear you into it. We're going to bring Haman as an example, right? They were scared he was going to kill them. So they did it. They didn't believe that Haman was an idol. They just bowed to him because they were scared of him. So are you obligated? famous machloket between Abai and Rava. Abai amar chayav, Rava amar patur. It's very fascinating machloket. You don't really believe it's your God. Again, this goes back to your thoughts. Why are you doing it? So Abai amar chayav, dahapalcha. You worshipped it. I don't care what you were thinking. You bow down to an idol. Rava amar patur. Says, what do you mean? You didn't accept it as a God. That's not worshiping idols. Amar Abai. Okay, here's a siman for the 3 proofs of Abai. We're going to do 2 today. We'll leave the 3rd for tomorrow because it starts in today's stuff, but it continues through tomorrow, and I don't want to kind of end mid thought. So Amar Abai, Mina Minala. First proof for today. Mina Minala Ditnan. Ha'oved avodah zarah chad oved. Now, remember we started with this question. Why does it say oved? Isn't all the other things oved? So what is oved? So our answer, the Gemara gave, Rabbi Yirmiya's answer was, oved, right? There's kidarka, there's lo kidarka, and then we started that whole distinction, which got us off on our first topic for today. But Abai says, no, I don't understand it that way. He says, my lavachad oved. What is that? Oved, what that extra word there comes to teach you, even if you're oved out of love or out of fear. And there's my proof. To which Rav is obviously going to reject it and say, no, I understand that the way Rabbi Yirmiya does, that's not a good proof. Okay, that Oved is coming to teach you about the Kedarka, Lo Kedarka distinction and which actions are and which actions aren't. Second answer, Amar Abai, Mina Amina. So Abai says, fine, I'll bring a different proof. You rejected that one, I'll bring a different one. Tanya, Lo Tishtachaveh Lehem. Okay, this is idols, right? Don't bow to them. And now they say, right, also from the Parsha, right, from yesterday, the 10 Commandments, you can't bow down to idols, but you can bow down to a person. Like, let's say you go to the king, and the way to bow down is, right, out of respect. You bow down. You can bow down to a person, as long as you're not making them into an idol. Wait. Even someone like Haman, though, who bowing down to him was like worshiping an idol. In other words, there's 2 different ways of bowing. Bowing out of respect or bowing out of an idol. So does that mean you can even bow down to Haman? No. That's what the pasuk says. Don't bow to them, and that would be bowing only if they're an idol, right? But lo tavdem is, bowing means you can bow. Don't bow to an idol, bow to a person. But bowing to a person is a problem. It says lo tavdem, but don't worship them. If bowing is worship, that's a different story. So now they say, here's my proof. Abai says, and what do you see? You can't do it. So there's my proof. You can't worship someone out of fear. So what's Rava going to say? An interesting answer. Well, we didn't mean exactly like Haman. What we meant was, we wanted to give you an example of a person that people worship like an idol. But but the people who worship Haman out of fear, actually, they weren't doing avodah zarah. We were just bringing you an example of a person who could be worshipped as an idol, and that was Haman. But the Jews who worshipped him because they were scared that he was going to kill them, weren't actually obligated for avodah zarah. And there goes Rava, and Rava says, see, that proof is not a good proof. And back to my proof, which is worshiping out of yira is not, you don't get killed. Okay, the 3rd proof we're going to leave because it's a whole big topic in and of itself, and it's going to, the whole argument is going to continue in tomorrow's stuff, so we'll stop here. So we had basically 3 sections. The first section was this Rava bar Rav Chanan's question about the whole drasha we said yesterday, and maybe Zobechel and Yecharam is not for here. Maybe Shachvaya teaches you about everything that even Shelo Kedarka you be chayav. And then we had how we answered the question, right? We had some questions on this question. We answered this question. Still had some questions on what was he thinking in the first place. What about other psukim? And then we moved on to this story with Rav Hamnuna when Rava bumped into him and said, what's this contradiction between the 2 Mishnayot? Are you obligated for speaking alone, or are you only obligated when you actually worship, like it seems from our Mishnah? And we had 7 resolutions to that contradiction. And then we got to this final machloket of Abai and Rava about someone who worships avodah zarah out of love or fear of a person, and because of that they worshipped. Is that considered worshiping? Because they're not really bringing it as a god. All these sugyot really got to this issue of how impactful are your thoughts? Because the whole question, the first question, was all based on machashvim avodah lavodah. How do we view your thoughts when it comes to avodah zarah? How important is that? How important a role does it play? A fascinating topic. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day, Shavua Tov, and B'sorot Tovot.